Mr. Speaker, and in light of the discussion about the points of order that we've just had, I too will return to a discussion of some of the process that the Regulations Review Committee, of which I am the Deputy Chair, undertook in considering this complaint. Because a few months ago the committee considered the complaint that had been lodged by the New Zealand Organisation for Rare Disorders about the New Zealand mandatory fortification of bread with folic acid amendment food standard of 2009. We heard evidence relating to the complaint from members of NZORD and from the New Zealand Food Safety Authority. All submitters were well prepared and presented their evidence and appeals with clarity and conviction. I want to acknowledge them all and thank them for the care and sincerity that they demonstrated. There is no question that the fortification of bread with folic acid has some health benefits for some women of childbearing age and their progeny who may be at risk of being born with a rare genetic disorder. That is why many countries have successfully introduced voluntary fortification of bread, and why the New Zealand government indicated last year that work would be undertaken on a voluntary standard that would allow some bread to be fortified. It was important for members of the Regulations Review Select Committee to restrict our focus during the hearing of the complaint and consideration of evidence to matters of process, and not to stray into matters of policy in accordance with the purpose of our committee. The focus of the Regulations Review Committee is technical scrutiny, not scrutiny of policy. Our role was therefore to consider the complaint against the grounds set out in standing orders, focusing on the technical aspects of the delegated legislation that were pertinent to the complaint. As a result of that consideration of the issues raised in the complaint, we concluded and reported to the House in August of this year that the 2009 Amendment Food Standard is in accordance with the general objects and intentions of the Food Act 1981, does not appear to make unusual or unexpected use of the powers conferred by the Food Act, and, most importantly in the context of this debate, was made in compliance with particular notice and consultation procedures prescribed by the Food Act. Mr. Speaker, I provide those details to the House because they underline the point made earlier by the Minister for Food Safety that the consultation process that was undertaken in New Zealand leading to the adoption of the New Zealand mandatory fortification of bread with folic acid amendment food standard of 2009 was comprehensive and robust. In seeking to have the standard disallowed by way of the resolution that we are debating this afternoon, Moana Maki is urging the House to revert to a position adopted by the former Labour government that attracted widespread opposition throughout New Zealand. Notwithstanding the earnest representations of NZORD, which we all understand and respect, there was strong evidence when the previous government announced its plans for mandatory fortification of bread with folic acid of stern resistance to the measure from New Zealanders. Labour intended to remove consumer choice. There was significant media coverage of the issue then and again when the new government responded to that widespread public opposition by commencing an investigation of this country's options, given that the standard was a feature of our joint food treaty with Australia. The government made a decision to ask New Zealanders whether they wanted mandatory fortification of their bread with folic acid. This was done by way of a discussion document being issued and public submissions being invited. Thanks to the significant media interest and coverage, members of the public were well aware of the issues under consideration and of their opportunity to influence the government's response, and they did so. Contrary to what members opposite are asserting, we were told in our inquiry that the level of responses at that time was entirely normal and as would be expected in the circumstances. We were told that, Ms Mackie, during the inquiry. That was a thorough and appropriate process. Those submissions resulted in an overwhelming indication from the public of New Zealand that they wanted to be able to choose whether or not they ate bread that was fortified with folic acid. Men in particular were concerned about some significant adverse health effects that they could experience from being subjected to the additive, and Sue Kedgley earlier referred to those. Elderly New Zealanders were also strongly opposed to the measure, and there is no evidence that anything has changed since they made their submissions. While consumer choice was therefore an important aspect, it should also be noted that it was not the only factor that the government took into account. The government's statement on regulations sets out the expectation that voluntary measures should be used in preference to regulatory measures where possible. Far from being a rubber stamp and an insulting process, as Moana Maki suggested as she concluded her speech earlier, the Regulations Review Committee undertook its work thoroughly. As Mr Chauvel indicated, we always do, and I do want to acknowledge that he is a fair, even-handed chairman. I think he does the job extraordinarily well. The committee undertook its work thoroughly and found on the evidence that the process followed was not only adequate but thorough. It's for that reason that this resolution will and should be voted down this afternoon.